Good evening. U.S. warplanes attacked targets in Libya tonight to retaliate for the terrorist bombing of a Berlin nightclub 8 days ago. The White House said the administration had tied that attack very directly to Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi and acted tonight to preempt and discourage further terrorist acts it said Libya was planning. The White House called the raids carefully planned airstrikes against terrorist-related targets. President Reagan is about to report to the nation. After his address on this special report, we will also hear from Defense Secretary Weinberger and Secretary of State George Schultz. Now, here is the President.
Eastern Time, air and naval forces of the United States launched a series of strikes against the headquarters, terrorist facilities, and military assets that support Muammar Gaddafi's subversive activities. The attacks were concentrated and carefully targeted to minimize casualties among the Libyan people, with whom we have no quarrel. From initial reports, our forces have succeeded in their mission. Several weeks ago in New Orleans, I warned Colonel Gaddafi we would hold his regime accountable for any new terrorist attacks launched against American citizens. More recently, I made it clear we would respond as soon as we determined conclusively who was responsible for such attacks. On April 5th, in West Berlin, a terrorist bomb exploded in a nightclub frequented by American servicemen. Sergeant Kenneth Ford and a young Turkish woman were killed, and 230 others were wounded, among them some 50 American military personnel. This monstrous brutality is but the latest act in Colonel Gaddafi's reign of terror. The evidence is now conclusive that the terrorist bombing of La Belle discotheque was planned and executed under the direct orders of the Libyan regime. On March 25th, more than a week before the attack, orders were sent from Tripoli to the Libyan People's Bureau in East Berlin to conduct a terrorist attack against Americans to cause maximum and indiscriminate casualties. Libya's agents then planted the bomb. On April 4th, the People's Bureau alerted Tripoli that the attack would be carried out the following morning. The next day, they reported back to Tripoli on the great success of their mission. Our evidence is direct, it is precise, it is irrefutable. We have solid evidence about other attacks Gaddafi has planned against the United States installations and diplomats and even American tourists. Thanks to close cooperation with our friends, some of these have been prevented. With the help of French authorities, we recently aborted one such attack, a planned massacre using grenades and small arms of civilians waiting in line for visas at an American embassy. Colonel Gaddafi is not only an enemy of the United States. His record of subversion and aggression against the neighboring states in Africa is well documented and well known. He has ordered the murder of fellow Libyans in countless countries. He has sanctioned acts of terror in Africa, Europe, and the Middle East, as well as the Western Hemisphere. Today, we have done what we had to do. If necessary, we shall do it again. It gives me no pleasure to say that, and I wish it were otherwise. Before Gaddafi seized power in 1969, the people of Libya had been friends of the United States. And I'm sure that today most Libyans are ashamed and disgusted that this man has made their country a synonym for barbarism around the world. The Libyan people are a decent people, caught in the grip of a tyrant. To our friends and allies in Europe who cooperated in today's mission, I would only say, you have the permanent gratitude of the American people. Europeans who remember history understand better than most that there is no security, no safety in the appeasement of evil. It must be the core of Western policy that there be no sanctuary for terror. And to sustain such a policy, free men and free nations must unite and work together. Sometimes it is said that by imposing sanctions against Colonel Gaddafi or by striking at his terrorist installations, we only magnify the man's importance, that the proper way to deal with him is to ignore him. I do not agree. Long before I came into this office, Colonel Gaddafi had engaged in acts of international terror, acts that put him outside the company of civilized men. For years, however, he suffered no economic or political or military sanction, and the atrocities mounted in number as did the innocent dead and wounded. And for us to ignore, by inaction, the slaughter of American civilians and American soldiers, whether in nightclubs or airline terminals, is simply not in the American tradition. When our citizens are abused or attacked anywhere in the world on the direct orders of a hostile regime, we will respond so long as I'm in this Oval Office. Self-defense is not only our right, it is our duty. It is the purpose behind the mission undertaken tonight, a mission fully consistent with Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. We believe that this preemptive action against his terrorist installations will not only diminish Colonel Gaddafi's capacity to export terror, it will provide him with incentives and reasons to alter his criminal behavior. I have no illusion that tonight's action will ring down the curtain on Gaddafi's reign of terror. But this mission, violent though it was, can bring closer a safer and more secure world for decent men and women. We will persevere. This afternoon, we consulted with the leaders of Congress regarding what we were about to do and why. Tonight, I salute the skill and professionalism of the men and women of our armed forces who carried out this mission. It's an honor to be your commander-in-chief. We Americans are slow to anger. We always seek peaceful avenues before resorting to the use of force. And we did. We tried quiet diplomacy, public condemnation, economic sanctions, and demonstrations of military force. None succeeded. Despite our repeated warnings, Gaddafi continued his reckless policy of intimidation, his relentless pursuit of terror. He counted on America to be passive. He counted wrong. I warned that there should be no place on earth where terrorists can rest and train and practice their deadly skills. I meant it. I said that we would act with others if possible and alone if necessary to ensure that terrorists have no sanctuary anywhere. Tonight, we have. Thank you, and God bless you.
President Reagan reporting to the American people from the Oval Office exactly 2 hours after waves of American planes attacked targets said to be terrorist-related targets in the Libyan cities of Tripoli and Benghazi. A few other items concerning those attacks. Members of Congress who were briefed today said that Gaddafi's own headquarters was one of the targets. Libyan radio reported that members of Gaddafi's family were injured in the attacks. They occurred at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, which was 2 a.m. local time in Tripoli and Benghazi, and they lasted approximately a quarter of an hour. Not only the widely expected attack from the carriers based in the Mediterranean, the Navy fighters from the carriers based in the Mediterranean, but the surprise in this mission was that fighter bombers, the larger F-111s based in Britain, were also used in the attack. In a few moments, we are expecting Defense Secretary Weinberger and Secretary of State George Schultz to appear in the White House briefing room to explain in more detail what happened tonight and why it happened, and to answer reporters' questions. Until they appear, we have reaction and analysis, and to start that, we go first to Judy Woodruff in Washington. Judy?
We turn now to a former commander of U.S. naval forces in the Mediterranean, retired Admiral Dan Murphy. He served as Chief of Staff for Vice President Bush during the first 5 years of the Reagan administration. He was also Deputy Director of the Central Intelligence Agency. He is now associated with Gray & Company, a Washington-based public lobbying firm. Admiral Murphy, first of all, what do you make of all this? Is this the sort of operation that you would have expected from the administration under these circumstances?
Oh, yes. For years, I've seen the president, try to nail down just who was responsible for these terrorist operations, and then to try to determine the kinds of targets that he could hit against. It's quite apparent from listening to the president tonight that he's associated both. He's got the person responsible, and he's got the kind of targets he's been wanting to hit, and I'm fully in favor of what he's done. What
is the significance of his bringing in these F-111 planes from Britain rather than just using planes based in the closer Mediterranean area?
Well, of course, I wasn't in on the operational planning, Judy, but from talking to some of the people who were involved, It appears that the carriers that we had in the Mediterranean, the Coral Sea and the America, were limited in the number of targets they could hit in a short period of time. And that it was to get all targets that the President had in mind, it was essential that we bring in a coordinated Air Force attack.
What do you make of the base of the targets that we are told? Gaddafi's bunker, Gaddafi's headquarters. Robin just mentioned that perhaps some of his members of his family were injured. Based on what you've heard tonight, what do you make of the targets that were selected?
Well, I have no information that they tried to hit Gaddafi's headquarters. He's a very elusive target in the first place, so I really can't comment on that. I understood there were a couple of terrorist-type training targets, and the others were military targets that have in the past responded against the Sixth Fleet.
So, in other words, you don't have any information beyond?
Not on the targets, Judy, no. We'll have to wait until Secretary of Defense Weinberger explains those.
Is it your expectation that this is the end of it? I mean, what would you think?
Well, the next move is up to Gaddafi. If he's going to come out and be foolish, he's going to get hit again. The President mentioned that tonight. So at the moment, it could be all finished. But if he's going to react foolishly and ask for more, you can expect that he's going to get more.
How successful would you say these strikes would have to have been for the President to be able to claim that he has actually contained future terrorist activity?
Well, in no way is the President saying he expects to contain it in the future. But what he said was you just can't sit by and let a mad dog, to quote a good phrase, get away with this constant terrorism without hitting back at him. He can't have a sanctuary, and he's not going to have a sanctuary. Now, whether or not it has a long-term effect on Gaddafi's thinking is something that we'll just have to wait and see what happens.
But as far as this, from what you've heard of this operation tonight, you wouldn't expect any more sorties by the American
No, I think it's
planes.
a limited, restrained action on the part of the President. If the target information that we have available right now turns out to be true, and I think it was certainly appropriate, and I hope that it has some effect on Gaddafi. Also, by the way, Judy, I have information just before I arrived that our forces did return safely without any U.S. casualties.
Is that right? That means that none of the planes were shot down?
Yeah, that's the first report that we have, and that is that they're all back safely.
All right. Admiral Murphy, we'll come back to you in a moment.
All right, Judy.
Robin?
Next, we have some congressional reaction from California Democrat George Brown, who serves on the House Intelligence Committee. Congressman, on this program Friday night, you told us you were not at all in favor of the idea of a strike against Libya. How do you feel now?
I feel the same way. I suspect, however, that the first reaction on the part of most members of Congress and the American public will be supportive. There is an emotional kind of reaction that has been expressed here tonight already, that we had to do something, and this will kind of relieve the pressure, and most Americans will say, well, he had it coming. I think my role is going to have to be to point out, however, that this action will have to be judged really more on the basis of the immediate emotional reaction, based upon whether or not it comports with American principles, with any concept of an international rule of law, whether it will tend to reduce our actual security and enhance terrorism in the world. In other words, we've got to apply both the test of principle and the test of pragmatism. And while it's a little difficult to do that right now, I would suspect that our tactics in this situation will probably be no more successful than that of the Israelis, and we're following their strategy at this point, going to the terrorists in their own headquarters or their own camps. And the Israelis have not found that this has solved their problems, and I doubt if we'll find that it solves our problem.
Before we go to some of those substantive issues you've raised, what about the subject of consultation with Congress? The President did talk to some members of Congress before this. Senator Dole said that he gave members of Congress an opportunity to say whether they strongly disapproved and before he made the final decision to go. I don't know whether you were included in that consultation.
No, the consultation was with the leadership in the House and Senate, and I don't know all of the individuals who were involved. The intelligence committees were not, to the best of my knowledge, consulted. Possibly the chairman had some notice on it.
I see. Is it your understanding that Congress was given an opportunity to object in this case?
The leadership who conferred with the president undoubtedly had the opportunity to object if they wished.
I see. Now, on the point of principle that you just mentioned, you just heard the president quoting Article 51 of the United Nations, which gives the member countries, as I understand it or remember it, an opportunity, or gives them the right to act in their own self-defense. You've heard the White House rationale.
Well, I understand that, and that's exactly the same rationale that we're using for supporting the countries in Central America and a number of other situations. We will use that as our legal basis.
Congressman, I hate to interrupt you. If you'd stay there, Secretary Schultz has begun briefing at the White House. We'll listen to him and then come back.
Part of the United States. The action was proportionate to the sustained, clear, continuing, and widespread use of terror against Americans and others by Gaddafi's Libya. As the President said, we must remember, and of course Europeans particularly remember, that tolerance or appeasement of aggression has historically brought more aggression. In Gaddafi's case, what we have seen over a period of years and escalating in recent months is a continuing increase in the use of terror. So this is not a question of something that we have done being countered by something he has done and so on. It has been an escalation by Gaddafi that has called forward this act of self-defense on the part of the United States. So under these circumstances, the President decided that it was time to act, and he did. Secretary Weinberger will describe more precisely what the action was.
At about 7 p.m. Eastern Time, elements, medium units of the 3rd Air Force attacked targets in the western Libyan zone, and at the same time, A-6s from the America and the Coral Sea attacked targets in the eastern Libya zone as listed here. The targets of the western zone were the military airport near Tripoli, the Azizia barracks, which are a command and control headquarters of the Libyan terrorist activities, and Sidi Bilal, which is a training area, including a maritime diver training unit for terrorists in the west. In the east, the Jamahira barracks, which is an alternate command post from the Azizia barracks, was also attacked, and the Benina Air Base, from which defensive, suppressive activities and air defense would be mounted, was attacked. We used a combination of 500-pound and 2,000-pound laser-guided weapons and precision-guided delayed gravity bombs. And all of the Navy planes have returned without casualty. All of the F-111s, with one exception, have been accounted for and are returning. There is one that is not accounted for at this time. They will reach their, recover to their home bases somewhere in the neighborhood of about 2 a.m. Eastern Time. The bomb damage assessment at the moment is limited, and we've not had full reports, but we do know that at Benina Air Base, the base was closed. They were unable to launch any aircraft. They had no lights, no radar, no communication as a result of the attack. We will have very full reports of the attack as the F-111s return to their bases in the early morning, and we will have more precise bomb damage assessments at that time. The attack was carried out precisely as planned, and it was, as the President said, evidence of very great skill, both the navigational as well as the organization of the attack, which was a difficult one from the professional point of view, and done with a great effectiveness. And we should have the full reports of the bomb damage assessment at that time. All of the targets were terrorist-related, and the criteria for selecting the targets was that they would be had a full terrorist connection, that we would minimize any collateral damage from civilian or other facilities nearby, that we would have full consideration for the safety of the pilots as a major consideration, and that they would be good night targets in the sense that they had good outlines that could be reflected on the radar and not mistaken for other targets.
Was there an effort, sir, to get Gaddafi personally?
No, there was not.
Family had been injured.
We don't know anything about those reports. They're from the Libyan radio.
Mr. Secretary, do you think you killed?
We have no idea that we killed anybody.
Mr. Secretary, do you believe that F-111 was shot down?
We don't have any indication to the fact at all. It's simply not accounted for at this time.
What other than it having been shot down, what other explanation could there be for not hearing?
Well, there are any one of a number of explanations. It could have radio trouble. It could be going to another base because of the radio trouble. It could have had an internal problem, an internal explosion, but there's no indication that it went down or was a victim of any enemy fire or anything of the kind.
There was also a report, sir, that you hit part of the French embassy in Libya. Do you know anything about that?
No, that would be, I think, virtually impossible. Yes.
Did Mrs. Thatcher approve the F-111s taking off from British soil?
I'm sorry?
Did Mrs. Thatcher approve the F-111s taking off from British soil?
Yes, permission was granted.
Can you tell us, sir, when the decision was made to proceed with this operation?
Over a considerable period of time as the evidence mounted and as the discussions were held.
Mr. Secretary, the number of aircraft involved.
I'm sorry?
Could you give us the number of aircraft
Yes,
involved?
there were about 18 F-111s initially that were planned for, and there were about 15 A6s and 7s, and supporting aircraft in addition to that in the form of tankers, the E-2Cs, the fighter cover, and various other missions that were flown at the same time. A very considerable number. I don't have the exact total. Could you put up the other chart? This is the route that was followed by the F-111s from the bases in England at Mendenhall and Lakenheath and Upper Hayford, and the tankers followed along down there, and they went through that as a total of about 2,800 nautical miles.
Was there
the Soviet Union told in advance?
Can you say if there was any permanent damage intended or likely to be inflicted by this, or is this really just a temporary?
Not at this, not in this scale. There was certainly no slight suggestion that it was any gesture of any kind. It was intended to do exactly as Secretary Schultz and the President said.
Was the Soviet Union informed?
They were informed, but George, you want to handle the time?
The Soviet Union was told that we had conclusive evidence of Libyan involvement in terrorist activity, including the Berlin bombing. At the time of the military operation, that is, as it was taking place, the Soviet chargé here, the senior Soviet in Washington, was called in and told of the operation. He was told why, he was told of our evidence, and he was told that this action was directed against Libyan terrorism and was in no way directed against the Soviet Union.
Mr. Secretary, to what extent do you think this settles the score with Libya, sir? To what extent do you think this settles the score with Libya?
Not a question of settling scores. It's a question of acting against terrorism, of saying to terrorists that the acts they perpetrate will cost them. If you raise the costs, you do something that should eventually act as a deterrent. And that is the primary objective, to defend ourselves both in the immediate sense and prospectively.
Secretary, what steps have been taken now in the wake of this attack in order to increase the security around United States embassies abroad, especially in the Middle East?
All of our embassies are on alert, of course. We have reports and indications, quite substantial evidence, of Libyan efforts to attack, varying degrees of certainty on the evidence, up to 30 of our embassies. So when I say that Gaddafi's planning is widespread, the evidence is quite clear that it is.
Recent planning?
Yes, absolutely.
Mr. Secretary, I would also add that the military installations around the world are also on full alert for attacks, terrorist attacks of any kind from any quarter.
If we had such good evidence and if we have such good intelligence about this, particularly what the spokesman and the president have said tonight, why were we unable to stop that Berlin attack if we knew one had been ordered the day before?
5 minutes.
We knew that they had ordered an attack in Berlin. Berlin's a big place. And we were in the process of trying to track down, and I think in Berlin and in other places, through the intelligence we collected, through the cooperation with other countries and their intelligence, we have been able to abort and stop a number of terrorist acts. And in this case, we were not able to identify the particular disco and get people cleaned out in time.
We were within 15 minutes, according to General Rogers, of getting notifications with respect to this particular installation as to the fact that it was potentially a dangerous area.
The Secretary's asking for a little order, and I concur that he should.
Okay, right here.
If you raise your hands, he will call on you.
Okay, I've called on him.
In light of the Syrian government's pledge to back the Libyan government in this crisis, are we now also on the alert for any Syrian-sponsored acts of terrorism directed against the United States?
We are on the alert for any acts of terrorism against the United States, and of course, we have a collaborative pattern with other countries, and we're as concerned about terrorism against others as we are about ourselves.
Following up, you indicated that we now have evidence that the Libyans were planning terrorist attacks against up to 30 U.S. embassy or diplomatic facilities.
That's right.
Do we have any evidence of Syrian planning to attack or launch terrorist attacks on Americans?
I have nothing that I'm prepared to talk about on that score at all. On the other hand, Syria has made the statement that you quoted. To what that will turn out to mean remains to be seen.
Secretary, why do we stand alone among the Allies, with the exception of Margaret Thatcher, apparently? Why did the European community caution us against retaliating, if our evidence is so good?
With respect to our allies, we have a variety of opinions, and I would have to say, having talked with a great many of them recently, opinions vary within those governments. And I think, in general, what we see is a shift in the direction of seeing very clearly what Gaddafi is, what he is doing, and gradually, more and more coming to the conclusion that something needs to be done about it. Today, the European community foreign ministers met. They were not apprised of what we were going to do, although some of those governments were aware of our plans, obviously the British. And they stepped up, in effect, their attitude of condemnation of Libya. They singled Libya out by name. So there is movement, but as you say, they do not yet share our conviction that action of this kind is necessary.
Was there a Soviet response from the Chargé here or from any other quarter?
Other countries will have to speak for themselves, including the Soviet Union.
Mr. Secretary, Secretary Weinberger,
yes.
Looking at the route followed by the aircraft,
yes.
Is that route evasive action, or is that to avoid flying over the soil of allies that might...
Well, obviously, if we had permission to fly a direct route, we would have not subjected the pilots to quite such a long flight. But given the available routes that we had, we left England and we reached Libya. It would have been, obviously, from an operational point of view, less risk to the pilots and a quicker time than it took to go the 2,800 nautical miles to get in there. There were, when a route of that kind is chosen, you also try to do as much as you can by changes of altitudes and so on to have the maximum evasiveness.
Yeah. 2,800 miles is an awfully long flight.
It is a very long flight. It is.
If you had permission for overflights on other countries' soil, how short?
We would have probably saved maybe close to 1,200 nautical miles. Down and 1,200 back.
What is the range of an F-111?
Well, it's refueled. Its range is virtually unlimited as long as you can refuel it, and they were refueled many times.
Was permission sought,
I'm
Mr.
sorry?
Secretary? Was permission sought, for example, from France and denied?
Well, I think that's a fair description.
May I ask a question about what if this does
I'm
not...
sorry. You had a follow-up. Yeah.
Other countries as well?
No, that would have been the direct route.
Can you explain, the President cited, for example, that the French assisted in uncovering...
That was an earlier case. They did indeed. Yeah.
If this does not deter Gaddafi and terrorism continue, what then?
That gets us into the hypotheticals, and as you know, I try not to deal with those. The President, I think, made it very clear that he didn't feel that this would necessarily automatically spell the end of terrorism. But I think it will send an unmistakable signal, and I think it will go very far towards deterring future acts. As the President said, we're prepared to take other action if it does not.
I'd like to follow that up, if I may, sir, by asking Secretary Schultz. You are the one who said that this was not a ratcheting up, or words to that effect, but a response in self-defense. But what if Gaddafi strikes back? Do we not then have to ratchet up our military response?
We will take the action that is wise as we see the situation unfold. What is clear tonight is that the United States will take military action under certain circumstances. That's established. That's very important. Now, the situation will unfold, and we'll see where we go from there.
Secretary Schultz, how much operational damage, though, does this do to Gaddafi and the terrorist operation? I mean, how long does this put him out of business? I guess what I'm asking is it an operational damage or a psychological blow that you're hoping to strike here?
Of course, we don't have any real damage assessment as yet, and we will get that, and we'll know more precisely what happened. But we seek to reduce his capability of carrying on terrorist acts, and I'm sure to some degree that was done. And we also have registered the point with him and with other Libyans that they will pay a price, that there is a cost to engaging in terrorism around the world. So they know that.
Mr. Secretary, did Mrs. Thatcher give one more question?
Go ahead.
Did Mrs. Thatcher give unqualified support, or did she set limits on what she was prepared to allow these planes?
Mrs. Thatcher had obviously many questions and concerns, and they were expressed, and the response was made to them, and permission was given to do what was done.
There are additional reports that the French embassy has been hit in Tripoli.
That I don't think could be accurate reports because of the nature of the targets and the nature of the ordnance used.
Our planes counter offensive, defensive fire. Our planes under fire. What about the oil installations? Why did you cut off their money?
What about Stockman?
How soon do you think you'll have a full report on casualties?
Larry, hold the chart.
There'll be 4 reports in the morning.
Secretary Weinberger and Secretary of State Schultz giving more information on tonight's attack on the targets they called terrorist-related targets in the Libyan cities of Tripoli and Benghazi. Go back now to our congressional reaction. We were talking to George Brown of California before the two secretaries came in with their briefing. We also have with us now a member of the House Armed Services Committee, Republican Duncan Hunter, also of California. What's your reaction to this evening's this evening's incident?
I think it was a classic case of a strong president defending the free world, defending the rights of American citizens to travel the world, and these rights were being seriously impeded by Mr. Gaddafi. I think the key factor in this whole situation was the interception of Libyan messages to his agents in East Germany with the order to kill Americans. And the further message back from the agents in East Germany that they would do everything possible to see that Gaddafi did not bear responsibility for the murders or for the destruction that would be wrought. I think that was the key fact that will result ultimately, I think, in the European community acknowledging or ratifying that the president took the right step.
Does it disturb you at all that this action was taken, as Secretary Weinberger has just indicated, with such little support from the European allies that they didn't have, the U.S. did not have permission to fly over their airspace, which would have halved the distance these planes had to go from Britain?
I don't think that's a problem. I think it's once again the lesson or the fact it was brought out that America sometimes has to stand alone. I think Great Britain can understand that. Mr. Churchill stood alone in the face of the Nazi conquest, had great difficulty even bringing the European allies into confrontation with Mr. Hitler. And I think that as time unfolds, as we continue to talk about the facts that we had before we took this action, the European community will come down solidly on the side of the United States.
Congressman Brown, about the evidence that the president gave and that Congressman Hunter has just repeated, does that alter your objections at all? Is it the kind of proof that would make you approve of what was done this evening?
Well, the evidence, of course, indicates that we have to do something about terrorism in the world. I don't think any reasonable person can say that we can continue to permit this. The real question is, what is the most effective way to deal with this problem? And the way the president has chosen, as I indicated earlier, is the one that I think meets our emotional needs, but does it meet our security needs? What I'm afraid of is that we're moving further and further away from a rule of law in the world, and I think that's self-evident. And we may be alienating more and more of our allies, both in Europe, by our unilateral actions in Latin America. This may be the step that will consolidate the Arab community and their opposition to the United States and throw them into the arms of the Soviets.
How do you react to those points, Congressman Hunter?
Well, I think, again, that that it was clear that we had to take action when Mr. Gaddafi was targeting Americans for death and when he, in fact, was taking action to kill Americans. And let me just say, as the congressman who put an amendment on last year's foreign authorization bill that brought about another means of dealing with Mr. Gaddafi, and that was export sanctions. It gave the president the power to bar exports from Libya. My amendment, frankly, failed. That economic pressure obviously did not deter Mr. Gaddafi in the least. So I think the United States has taken reasonable action to try to deter him from this course. It hasn't worked. And once again, the European peoples, I think, very much sympathize with what happened. They want to be able to travel Europe freely. Their diplomats
What about Congressman Brown's fears that this is going to further divide or alienate the United States from its European allies and consolidate the Arab world against the United States?
I think those fears are not well-founded, because I think that most of the moderate Arabs themselves live in great fear of Mr. Gaddafi. And in fact, this taking apart of Mr. Gaddafi on his home ground will probably cause him great political problem. In fact, he may be worrying right now, after the attack and after he has a chance to sit down and think about things, he may worry about his own political stability. He is not secure in his present position. The European community, once again, I think, will react to America's actions by ratifying those actions once they again review all the evidence, and we had a great deal of evidence that we couldn't put in front of them for security reasons before the strike.
Yeah, Congressman Brown?
Well, I think it's too early to say what the results and the reactions are going to be, which is why I exercise some caution in my own view. This kind of action does not comport with the way I think the fundamental problems of this world need to be solved. Gaddafi is not the problem. The problem is our failure to resolve the Palestinian situation, as Mr. Brzezinski said on your program Friday night, where I was also present. If we do not take steps to resolve the underlying problem, then we merely inflame that problem by what we're doing. And that's what I hate to see.
Another comment on that, Congressman Hunter?
Well, very simply, I don't think you can rationalize away Mr. Gaddafi's existence or his stated purpose by talking about problems that exist in the Middle East. I think Mr. Gaddafi is a disaster waiting to happen. The only thing that will satisfy him in the Middle East probably is the extermination of Israel. We obviously are not in a position to cede that particular goal to him.
Well, gentlemen, we'll come back. Judy?
We turn now to Geoffrey Kemp, a former special assistant to President Reagan for national security affairs. He specialized in U.S. policy towards the Middle East. He left the administration in 1984 and is now a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies at Georgetown University. Mr. Kemp, was this dramatic military move by the United States called for by what Colonel Gaddafi had done?
Oh, yes, it was called for, and I'm certain that what the administration was waiting for was first to get the forces in place so that you could do a very effective military job, and second, to see whether there was any possibility of getting European cooperation. And clearly this has paid off, because without the support of Margaret Thatcher and the use of the F-111s from the UK, the strike would have been much less effective.
But there were no other European countries that we know of who offered any support at all.
Nor should we have expected any at this point in time. The Europeans did not permit us overflying rights in 1973 during the Yom Kippur War, and I don't expect that they would have done so in this occasion unless they themselves had been hit by Gaddafi.
Well, why did the administration go to all the trouble of sending Vernon Walters over there to seek their support?
Well, I think, as Secretary Schultz pointed out, there's been a distinct shift in the European opinion over the past week, starting with the French decision to put terrorism on the agenda at the Tokyo summit, the decision of the Germans to expel Libyan officials from that country. Gradually, it seems to me, the Europeans are accepting that there is a smoking pistol. The smoking pistol is located in Tripoli.
What would you say the administration has accomplished tonight? I mean, assuming there were some targets that were hit, assuming there were some Libyan casualties, what have we accomplished?
Well, I don't think in terms of material damage or affecting terrorism we've done very much. I think what we have done, however, is put on record not just Gaddafi, but the Syrians and our friends in the Arab world and in Europe, that if necessary we will go it alone, and that we're capable of going it alone, and we can do a lot more the next time round than what we did this evening. I think we've also sent a signal that this type of escalation ultimately is going to involve the Europeans and the Arabs, whether we like it or not.
But you just heard what Congressman Brown said. He said this is going to further divide us from our European allies, that it's going to make Gaddafi even more of a hero, perhaps, among the Arabs.
Well, it may, in the first instance, create some street support for Gaddafi, but I can tell you privately, most moderate Arab leaders are hoping that those strikes were very successful. Now, they may say something else in public, but privately, they loathe him, and they want to see him removed. Now, you see...
Why don't they say so publicly?
Because they have their own constituencies. Every leader in Europe and the Mideast has his own constituency that they have to be careful about. And you see, this isn't just a question of the rule of law, to go back to some point the congressman made. The point is that Gaddafi may, at some point in the future, use nuclear weapons or really nasty methods to conduct terrorism. At that point, we've got to understand that this is a global problem, that if we don't take action, no one's going to. And that it's all very well to wish we could do it another way. We've been arguing with the Europeans now for 3 years that we should use economic sanctions, that we should boycott the Libyans, and every time they say, no, our economic interests outweigh that. There comes a point when you can't have it both ways.
Geoffrey Kemp, stay with us. Robin?
Now some speculation as to the impact today's events will have in Libya. From Henry Schuler, the Director of Energy and National Security Program at Georgetown University's Center for Strategic and International Studies. He spent 10 years in Libya, working at the U.S. Embassy and American oil companies operating there. On Friday night with us, Mr. Schuler, you were perhaps the most dubious as to the efficacy of this kind of attack on Libya. How do you feel tonight?
Well, let me say that only the Commander-in-Chief can decide whether the evidence is adequate, whether the targets are appropriate, and whether a surgical strike was possible. I will assume that it was justified on the basis and the President made the correct decision. But that is not going to achieve what must be our goal of isolating Gaddafi and removing Gaddafi, having the Libyan people remove Gaddafi. So having sent the signal that Geoffrey Kemp indicated, and having solved our psychic needs, as Congressman Brown has indicated, we must still face the difficult questions of how do we bring about the removal of Gaddafi by the Libyan people.
Now, will this, in the short run, contribute to that, since they are led by a person who's allowed their country to become vulnerable to U.S. attacks, or precipitated those attacks, or will they rally around him and tend to treat him even further as a hero?
Well, my strong fear is that they will, in fact, rally around him. I think that that's human nature, whether it's Libyan, American, or whatever. And I think that he will emerge from this stronger. I don't think any Libyans thought that he could take on the superpower of the United States. So the fact that he has proved vulnerable does not seem to me to be something that is going to encourage them to resist him. I think that they will rally around, and that's why I feel it's counterproductive.
What about other Arab countries? You've just heard your colleague Geoffrey Kemp say that privately many Arab leaders would be very, very happy to see him go, but they will never say so publicly. What is going to be the situation in terms of Arab solidarity in the immediate wake of this?
Well, I think that I would agree 100% that they, many of them, with the exception of Hafez Assad in Syria and the Ayatollah Khomeini, who is, of course, not an Arab but a Muslim Middle Eastern state, the rest of them will be very happy to see Gaddafi removed, but he has not been removed. He is there, and he is probably strengthened. And I think that they will therefore come out in terms of Arab solidarity. Now this, sure, it's just lip service, and it doesn't matter. We can say it's lip service, but what it does is permit Gaddafi to break out of the isolation that he puts himself into through his incursions in Tunisia and Chad and Sudan and so forth. He isolates himself, and then these Arab leaders are prompted to come out and say that they stand united with Gaddafi. Gaddafi plays that back to the Libyan people, and the isolation is eliminated. So the Libyan people are no longer prompted by that concern of being out of step with the rest of the Arab world.
What, apart from a temporary, perhaps, resurgence of Libyan patriotism around Gaddafi and the Arabs paying lip service to their horror at this attack on him, what harm, if it hasn't actually solved the terrorism problem or the Gaddafi problem, what harm will this attack have done, if any?
Well, those are the two most important things we must achieve, is undermining his support at home and increasing his isolation in the region.
Are you suggesting, do I read in what you're saying, that you would have been happier if the United States had actually gone for him personally as a target, as Secretary Weinberger denied they did?
I suppose, frankly, from a moral point of view, if you're going after anybody's life you're willing to take, it doesn't much matter whether it's the leader or the innocent frankly, it's preferable to go for the leader than the innocent bystander, and perhaps preferable to go for the leader to some lower-ranking officers. But I don't advocate the military course at all.
Well, thank you. Judy?
Let's go back now to Dan Murphy, retired Navy Admiral, a former Chief of Staff to Vice President Bush. You just heard what Mr. Schuler said about he thinks the Arabs are going to rally around Colonel Gaddafi as a hero.
Well, I think I take exception with Mr. Schuler, and this is not just based on my own feelings. I've talked to many Arab ambassadors right here in Washington, and there is opinion among some of them that the Libyan military will turn against Gaddafi mainly because of the great humiliation that they have suffered in the Gulf of Sidra, and now following these attacks on their own bases where their military systems are not working too well. Hope to God that our F-111 gets back safely, but their overall record has been disgraceful. And there is an outside chance that the military is going to say, you have done enough to us, you have not provided us with the tools, and we're taking an awful beating, and we've had enough of you. And they are the only force in Libya, I think you would agree, Mr. Schultz, that could possibly turn against Gaddafi.
But that's just now speculate. That's just hope on the part of these other Arab diplomats.
Oh, there's nothing sure, Judy, in the world. Yes, it is speculation, but it's, I'd say, a well-informed speculation.
Congressman Brown, what do you make of that? Do you think there's a chance that something like that could...
Oh, yes, there is a chance, but the history of this situation as it's unfolded doesn't indicate that that's a very strong chance. The phenomenon of rallying around the leader when he's under attack by this great superpower of the West, the enemy of all of the Arabs, seems to work in the opposite direction. It seems to lead to stronger support for Gaddafi. Now, I will confess that we could all be proven wrong tomorrow as to what's going to happen in this situation. Because once you unleash violence, it's very difficult to predict what the results are going to be.
What about Jeff Kemp's point a moment ago that we're not just, I mean, the level of what we're discussing here may be far more serious than any of us realize at this point, that at some point down the road, Gaddafi may have chosen to bring nuclear weapons into this?
Well, we know that Gaddafi has sought to get nuclear weapons by purchase or theft or whatever. He may redouble his efforts, and he won't deliver them with a guided missile. He'll probably put them in an old boat and deliver them to a U.S. naval base.
Judy, I think the chances of that happening are so slim that we shouldn't try
to scare... The chances of what happening?
Of Gaddafi getting a hold of a nuclear weapon. There's no sense in scaring the American people on your program. The chances are so close to zero, I don't even think it should be mentioned.
Well, I would have to disagree with you. There are thousands of nuclear weapons stationed in Europe today.
They're well protected.
They're well protected, but efforts to determine how well protected, conducted by competent investigators, show there are many flaws in the system.
I was in charge of it. I have a good idea what it was.
All right, you know what the reports were then.
Yes, and we've corrected. We've spent millions and millions of dollars in correcting those security problems.
Jeff Kemp was the one who brought that up. Let's go back.
My point is not that Gaddafi is about to get hold of a nuclear weapon, but first, that there are more and more countries have nuclear weapons, they're more available. Secondly, there are many more leaders like Gaddafi who are willing to take steps to get hold of them. And some point down the line, we have to accept that terrorism could get worse. And at that point, you know, we're going to have to take draconian measures to prevent it or at least control it. And that, I don't want to scare anybody at all that something's imminent, but it's a very serious long-term problem.
Congressman Hunter, how far do you think the United States should be prepared to go to retaliate against any further terrorist moves by Gaddafi? I mean, should we be prepared for more attacks like this one? I mean, how much more should we be prepared for?
I think the Secretary of State said it well when he said we wanted to give or to make a proportionate response. And in response to my colleague and the other gentlemen who have said that we're making a mistake by doing something militarily, I think that we need to take the lesson from Israel. Israel initially bargained with terrorists, negotiated with terrorists, attempted to use a lesser means of dealing with them. And when they would have a bus full of children held hostage one day and they would attempt to talk their way out of it, next week they might have 2 busfuls held hostage, and ultimately they came to the conclusion that the only thing they could do was to react militarily, the one thing that terrorists understand. And I think the question, to throw back to my colleague, Mr. Brown, and the other gentleman, is simply this. We've tried economic sanctions. I've been part of that. Jerry Solomon from New York, Ben Gilman, many other members of Congress. I think Mr. Brown has voted on those amendments himself. And we have passed laws, and we have tried to get the European community to rally around us. That hasn't worked. So I guess the question I would throw back to you is, what would you do? Would you simply allow Mr. Gaddafi to openly, at least from our intelligence reports, order the killings of American citizens without taking action?
Let's put that to Mr. Schultz.
Let me make something absolutely clear, because everybody makes the point that economic sanctions have been tried and failed. They have not been tried. There are 5 American companies in Libya today producing oil, paying hundreds of millions of dollars to Gaddafi in taxes, taking a U.S. tax credit, by the way, for their payments to Gaddafi, but paying those taxes to Gaddafi, who then purchases the weapons to fire at American planes. Now, you can't tell me economic sanctions have been tried when we permit 5 American companies to produce oil and countless others to assist Gaddafi in the drilling of wells and every other thing. Now,
I can respond to this.
When we take care of that, then we can go to the Allies, having set an example. We have not set an example at this point. So to say that we have tried economic sanctions and they failed is simply erroneous.
You want to respond quickly?
Absolutely. Let me respond to that. We have, in fact, the President has ordered a bar of imports from Libya, and we have had absolutely no effect on the European community without any American interaction. Mr. Gaddafi has a very solid economic base stemming simply from our European allies, and these are the same allies who will not allow us to fly our airplanes over their air lanes.
Anybody here want to make a quick prediction about what happens next? Jeff Kemp?
If the military strikes have been successful, that is to say few casualties, both American and Libyan, I think we can say it's been successful. Everyone else will say it's been a failure.
Gentlemen, thank you all for being with us. Congressman Hunter, Congressman Brown, Geoffrey Kemp, Henry Schuler, and Admiral Murphy. Robin?
And summing up tonight's events, the United States carried out a series of air attacks against what it said were terrorist targets in and around the Libyan cities of Tripoli and Benghazi. President Reagan told the nation it was necessary in self-defense and said that if necessary, the U.S. will do it again. The Libyans said 3 U.S. planes were shot down and their pilots and crews killed by civilians on the ground. Defense Secretary Weinberger said only 1 U.S. plane was unaccounted for. The strikes were carried out by Navy jets from 2 6th Fleet carriers and about 18 Air Force F-111s based in Britain. Secretary of State Schultz said Moscow had been assured that the operation was in no way directed against the Soviet Union. Good night, Judy.
Good night, Robin. That's been our special edition of the NewsHour. We'll be back again tomorrow night. I'm Judy Woodruff. Thank you and good night.
Funding for the MacNeil Lehrer NewsHour is provided by AT&T. Whether it's telephones, information systems, long-distance services, or computers, AT&T. Funding also is provided by this station and other public television stations, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.